What he wanted to do in the very first email, I've got this J-tube I want to convert to a batch box. I want to use this metal box stove that I've got as part of it. Can we do that? And so that's the question I get all the time. I want to build whatever stove. I've got an old box stove. Can I use it somehow for this build? So if you email me and ask me that question, I am pretty much always going to say no. You cannot use your box stove. Just put it aside and forget about it for now. And that's what happened in this build, for the most part. For the most part, I said, no, let's just ignore that for now. And let's worry about building the stove the right way first. Because in my opinion, the box stove represents materials that we have to work with. But what ends up happening is people will look at the box stove and instead think it represents the diameter, the perimeter of the stove and the dimensions of the stove. And so they'll then change everything about a rocket mass heater to try and fit into whatever shape and size their box stove is. Yeah, thanks, Dan. It has been 31 weeks. I do feel pretty organized, actually, doing this every Wednesday. It's a little more regular than a lot of stuff in my life. So anyways, when I get those box stove questions, I'm always going to say no, because what ends up happening is it just ends up taking your build down a really, really the wrong direction. You instantly try starting to fit a stove into that box, and you instantly go way out of all of the appropriate rocket mass heater proportions, and you end up with something that doesn't work very well and doesn't look very good. And there's just a whole lot, and was hard. That's the biggest thing, is that as soon as you try to incorporate that metal box stove, you're struggling to make things fit, and you're cutting and grinding wheels, and it makes things really difficult, when all you really needed to do was probably stack up some bricks or cut some ceramic fiberboard and just start building the stove the right way. So I'm always going to say no when you ask me about using a box stove. However, there's some attractive pieces on a box stove, right? Like the door is usually something that is really attractive to try and reuse. So good, Doug. I'm glad it's timely. It's a great. It was really eye-opening for me this last few weeks, and so I'm making this really long. But basically, where I want to get to with this whole thing is, for the most part, I want you to never consider doing that. But in this case, it worked, and I'll tell you why. So what we did is we just put the door or the whole stove aside and said, let's not worry about the metal stove for now. But he had sent me a photo of it. And it was odd, because it was... Where's my camera? Most box stoves are landscape orientation, right? Like they typically they have a long door, and they're shorter than they are wide. Well, this stove, and it's not totally rare, the little Joe Tools are this way too, but just like our rocket mass heaters, it was the appropriate orientation anyway. I didn't know about the size, but at least it was taller than it was wide, and it had a double door that had some nice big air inlets on it, so it looked like it had enough secondary air. I was like, okay, well, it's not too far out of realm, but let's just put it aside and let's see what we can do. And so we did a by-the-book brick 8-inch batch box right off of Peter's website. This wasn't a stove that we built to my plans. It was just a consult job that I just helped him achieve his goals. And so we chose Peter's brick, standard brick batch box in an 8-inch system size. And I sent him some drawings and showed him how to mock up that core. And once he mocked up that core, he was then able to bring that stove over, and we were able to evaluate it. And what do you know? That wood stove was like 2 inches wider than the whole rocket stove fire brick core, and like an inch taller. I mean, it was just about perfect. So what he ended up doing was he left it intact, and I'm probably going to get this a little bit wrong, but he basically left the two sides and the front with the door and the top. So you just a wood stove with the bottom cut off and the back cut off, basically. And then he built his brick firebox, and we were kind of wondering how to do the ceiling of the firebox. And we realized we could just wrap that whole core in a couple layers of 1-inch, 8-pound density ceramic wool, and then set that whole steel stove right over the top. It snugged that wool against the core. It sealed up all the edges around there. It formed the roof of the firebox with ceramic wool as the roof to protect the steel of the stove. The door, perfect fit. The whole thing landed on ceramic wool, so it would all be sealed there. I made sure that he used ceramic wool everywhere it was interfacing masonry, so then it ran into the whole rest of the stove. Actually looks just like Belgian Gulches, brick. There's a big brick manifold that the barrel sits on. The barrel landing is brick, and then it goes across the front, and it interfaces with that steel stove. And so again, you just put ceramic wool. Anywhere where that steel interfaces masonry, you put ceramic wool for an expansion joint. So he's able to lay the bricks then across the front of the stove as well and build up the barrel landing. Right? You guys can picture it. And then you could mortar over that expansion joint just to add a little stability once the barrel lands. Barrel lands on ceramic wool right there. Seal it up. You guys, it looks awesome. I mean, they're always going to be a little funky looking when you have the metal and the brick, but it came together so well. And one of the things I was most pleased with was our method of using the ceramic wool everywhere where the metal interfaces. That's something I always do in our builds, but in this case it was a big chunk of steel. So it was significantly different than anything I've really seen come together. And like I said, this is something that I've always said, you know what, it's just better not to do it. But by using, this is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, by using these methods that we're coming up with, brick core, insulating layer, skin on the outside, this thing really was a lot like my aluminum series stoves. I mean, we got there a different way, but we had the same components in the same places. And once I start to look at the builds that way, all of a sudden it's like, oh, these, interesting material combinations, things are just becoming much more possible. And honestly, I think ceramic fiber is a huge part of it. That build would have been really challenging if we weren't able just to interface the steel with the masonry by using that wool. We used wool, not board. So just a little word of encouragement to anyone out there who has some bits and bobs that they're hoping to use. Don't rule those things out, but at the same time, don't let them guide your build. So stick with the proper core dimensions, stick with the tried and tested methods and materials, but you may find that there's places where you can use parts of a box stove that you might not have otherwise thought of, where you can use cast iron tops or things like that. And so that's really the moral of that story. And the biggest point, I guess, of all of that is anywhere you're using metal in these stoves, anywhere it interfaces masonry, we now all have access to ceramic wool. In the old days, they used to call it mason's felt, and we would use that in our expansion joints. It took me forever to learn about that stuff and even find out where to buy it. Now you can just order it, Home Depot or whatever. And so I really want to encourage you guys, if you're incorporating metal into your builds, do be sure to incorporate expansion joints using ceramic wool if you can. There's other ways to do it, but that's just it's a great modern technique. So that's it.